touch on is just three things. I wanted to reflect on the Australian experience, but also talk about some of the improvements that you're no doubt perhaps aware of in terms of the Online News Act in Canada. I'll talk about where that kind of policy journey is heading. I also want to raise the prospect of the potential of simpler options than the quite convoluted arbitration mechanisms that we've seen become internationally popular. And of course, you know, people are free to ignore my ideas, and I thought I'd end up with some suggestions for implementations if we decide to move forward with the more complex kind of legislation that's been popular in Australia and Canada to date. So in terms of the Australian experience, you know, we know it's not a link tax. It won't break the internet. And we know, we've heard it's given a lot of money to journalism in Australia. But I think I'd agree with Peter here that the code is still quite opaque. We don't know how much deals are. And I think its first iteration perhaps unfairly just targeted Facebook and Google search, which I think was a bit too narrow. Of course, I recognise it was the first time anybody did this in a very complex political environment. I think we're seeing real improvements from the Canadian experience and even the maturations of the Australian reforms. So I think as India starts to consider this reform, I think there's already an opportunity, as others have noted, to look at subsidiaries like Instagram or YouTube, but also consider Apple News and other platforms. We know Meta's moving away from news. We know Twitter is collapsing every week. So I think there's real scope as these reforms are implemented in other countries to keep that question of which platforms should be in the room quite open. I also just wanted to briefly touch on the ministerial designation mechanism of the ACCC led, which, as Rod Sims noted, Professor Sims noted, was the treasurer, or he would be the finance minister. I do find this somewhat arbitrary, even with the wonderful input from the ACCC. You know, I think Canada has kept it quite cleanly, with the platforms having to contact the communications regulator by a certain time period. It's slightly cleaner. It ensures clear lines between the regulator and the affected parties. I think a really great example of this is the algorithmic transparency, which Emma and Peter discussed earlier. Algorithmic transparency only happens under designation. Since no platforms are designated, there is no need to provide algorithmic transparency. I realise that's not the core outcome of this discussion. We're interested in the money, but I think it does say something about ensuring those clear lines between the regulator and the parties under effect. I think the wonderful work of Emma at Minderoo kind of speaks to a really critical part of implementation, which Paul also spoke to, that there can be a lack of capacity for small publications to secure a deal without support. Many of these publications were struggling for some time without the wonderful work of the Minderoo Foundation. So, you know, I think it's really critical in implementation to think about small publisher capacity. As Paul mentioned, building those structures around collective bargaining. And this is less about the kind of mechanics of the bill, but really about that implementation piece. I'm afraid I have to agree with Peter here, though, about the question of the opaque nature of the bill. As many people have noted, the value of news is still unclear. You know, even the leader, Professor Sims, could construct 200 million on the back of an envelope. Media businesses may be happy, but it's still an unanswerable problem. I may be betraying my academic leanings here, but I'm really fascinated in the value of news. It would be great to know what that number is. I think Canada has taken a really good step here with the requirement of an annual independent auditor to actually audit these payments. Our review in Australia, as far as I understand, is just on the initial success of the law, but I think we do need a watching brief on these. I don't necessarily think these deals need to be public, but I think this is a significant intervention by government. And if government and relevant policymakers get an understanding of these deals, what the overall funding space for media environment is, and actually helps us answer this question about what is the value of news, I think that's a really beneficial outcome. Moving on to public interest journalism, I agree with Emma. I think, you know, we can't force this money to go into shoe leather. Paying down debt is absolutely reasonable. But I do think it is a core logic of the bill, and I do take Paul's point that we need to address the kind of ensure that the actual public interest journalism is supported, that news media outlets are not just taking this and running with it. And I note quite positively of the public commitments of some outlets to actually tell their readers, not in detail, but broadly what they're doing with this revenue, this new revenue stream, which I think is really positive. So I'm moving now. Australia tried to really frame it as a market-led law, and Professor Sims obviously noted that. But I think the more I think about this intervention, the more I think this is really about government and journalism working quite closely to secure its future. The Canadian legislation is quite didactic, criteria-based, even more so than the Australian legislation, and really sets clear terms for engagement for these parties. So in a way that leads me to talk about the quite complex nature of these early iterations, noting the designation, not having algorithmic transparency and so on, the complexities of market management, trying to secure support by small publishers to get deals through. This was mentioned in a recent International Institute of Communications conference in Ottawa and shared by my colleague, Professor Derek Wilding, a really rich discussion, again, about platform levies or taxes, a simpler fund to achieve the same goals. Obviously, there's disquiet about, even at arm's length, having government involvement in media, but I think I'd argue government's already in the room. They've made a significant intervention in this relationship already. There's existing kind of history in Australia. So we already levy private telecommunications providers to ensure positive social outcomes by funding a consumer advocacy body. So I think there are kind of backgrounds that could help us understand how to inject a levy in a way that provides perhaps a clearer criteria-based approach. But obviously, if we move ahead, I think Canada, the legislation that it has still has some much, perhaps stronger, slightly stronger criteria than what's on the books in Australia. I think just to throw a spanner in the works, I did just want to raise the question of, do we want platforms to fund news? We know that digital platforms are transient. We know that they're not always with news for the long haul. Twitter's falling over, Meta's trying to walk away. How much do we actually want to tie these industries together through payments? I've tried to be practical in this talk. I recognize this is where the international conversation is, but I always think it's worth raising this question. We know that some media were really reliant on social traffic. How much are we going to be reliant on platform funding? And I do take Paul's point, and I really agree with him that I think, whatever happens in terms of platform web payments, I think digital advertising reform is perhaps the more critical area where ensuring that opaque space of whether it's Google's dominance or third-party advertiser providers is really where a lot of loosening of revenue and securing that revenue could be really beneficial. So I'll just end, presuming we don't want the levy, presuming you don't want to listen to me about digital advertising reform, with some nuts and bolts implementation. I think, like many speakers have said, ensuring that any reform is agile and responsive, I think that criteria-based legislation is critical. I really think it's critical that spending from the reform is reviewed regularly. And I think this isn't just about, government or public, but it's about trust. We know that there's a kind of trust deficit, and media is always needing and increasingly needing to build trust with audience and citizens in a populist environment. I think spending commitments, particularly around these kind of spending commitments, are just, if possible, a really great way to show that commitment to the public interest. In terms of transparency of deals, I think, Canada has really provided the policy armor, I think the kind of policy language to provide that transparency, at least to a governmental level. And just to finish, I think despite all that practical advice, I think it's still worthwhile reflecting on that problem of platform dependency and how and where the news media decides strategically to make itself dependent on platforms in whichever way it chooses to do so. So, I think it's really not just about, as everybody in this room knows, about that opportunity to get the money, but a story of how do we secure investment in good journalism while we're paying the trust back to both government who's progressed this intervention, but also the citizens who we're doing this for in the first place. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Tanmay, you want to ask first question to James, and then we can move to the audience questions.
Thank you, James, for the wonderful insights you have given us. I couldn't agree more that trust is the ultimate thing, and as a media organization, that's what all of us should ultimately be striving for. It's wonderful to hear your views. Can you elaborate a little bit more on deals and their dependencies, because you have a very clear view that the Canadian view is a much better view than the Australian view, but a lot of deals are one-to-one deals, right? There are deals, a lot of deals are never put out in public domain, because they are because it's an arrangement between two independent players. So why do you feel that each and every deal should be made out public, and it should be out in the open?
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Tanmay. It's a really important one. I might not have been clear, but I don't actually support the public disclosure of these deals. I think I think they are quite sensitive documents, but I think what Canada's already kind of started to think about doing is requiring more information from both parties. So actually auditing these processes. And I think that's, I must admit, I'm not au fait with the deep details of the Canadian experience, but the kind of details that they're asking for are total commercial value of these deals, the distribution of commercial value across these deals, and the effect of these agreements, right? So I think, just by securing a little bit more, not too much, but a little bit more than that top line figure of $200 million, which, Rod Sims himself admits as a guesstimate. I'm sure a very good guesstimate. I'm sure Rod is across all of that, but he's not privy to those deals. Because we need to know this is working. I think, from my perspective, this is a really innovative and really fantastic legislation. Obviously, we're seeing some really great benefits, but I still view this, and perhaps more than other people, as quite a dynamic space. I'm not sure how much platforms are going to be with news for the long run. Google, sure, I think so, but others maybe will come and go. And I think we really need a close eye from policymakers around how is this working, and really how is this affecting the market. The government is intervening in quite a significant way here, and we need to ensure that that intervention is done sensibly and carefully. So, I don't want the deals put on the front page of every paper, but to the extent they can be provided to the responsible people in government, I think that could be a step forward.
Okay, linked to that question, you think there's any practical way in which the big tech could be encouraged or incentivized to share due revenues with news organization? And is that something that should be explored?
Sorry, share what revenues? New revenues?
Share revenues with news organizations.
Well, I think really this is probably it, to be honest. I think, in terms of new ways, I wouldn't so much as suggest that I would know better than some of the wonderful and intelligent people that have devised these reforms, which are quite complex. And I don't necessarily see that the tech industries, and I'm not criticizing them here, but I think they legitimately don't see that they have a business commitment to news, and beyond that, it's a positive social outcome, and everybody should support news. We've seen publicly many of these outlets don't necessarily see journalism as something tied to their business. Based on the Australian experience, I think Google is the most likely candidate because they provide information, and they're even the way their search results are set up and its reliance on news as a source of data is the kind of platform most likely to be open to future revenue sharing. And I think conversely, on the other hand, the other way to secure revenues, I think, is to actually, it's going to be more challenging. It's going to be tackling that digital advertising piece, which is, you know, in the same way opposition to Google. So, you know, Google has an interest in news because of its trade in information. But by the same token, you know, it's good on one hand, but on the other, it's also the villain in many ways, and the platform that's capturing much of that revenue, as Paul mentioned. And I think, you know, we've seen the Competition Markets Authority in the UK and the ACCC here is doing fantastic work on the structuring of the digital advertising market. And I think reforms in that area, you know, I'm optimistic, obviously, but could potentially pull back some of that revenue into public interest journalism or journalism more generally.